great speakers lined up for all of you. And we've built in some time for a few questions and answers after some of the medical doctors talk. So where's our microphone that they can come up to and ask? Thank you.
It will be on the stand here.
Yeah, I think if you could set that up more in the middle of the room,
Okay.
that'd be great. So my name is Brenda Conger, if you haven't met me throughout the event, and I'm going to turn it over now to Gina.
Hi everybody and welcome again. We have a very exciting program for everyone today and we hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Pilar Migoulas is a CFC International board member and she's also a genetic counselor at Texas Children's Hospital. And she's going to talk to us today about the history of CFC and CFC International. So welcome, Pilar.
Pilar, CFC presentations folder on the bottom. Up a little bit, the folder to the left there. Slideshow. And slideshow at the top, Pilar. Yeah. And then, yeah.
All right. Good morning, everybody. All right, so I'm happy to be here. I've been involved with the CFC organization now for the past 11 years as a board member, and my story and history of CFC actually got started in 2002 when I was a grad student at Northwestern in Chicago, and I met a little boy in one of our clinics who had a presumptive diagnosis of CFC, and from that point on I just became very interested in the condition and learning all I could about what it was, how it impacts families, and so I'm very happy to present the history of CFC and CFC International to you. I think these two actually go very hand in hand, and Brenda had asked me, do you want the title to be the history of CFC or CFC International? And I really don't think you can talk about one without the other, because they're very closely intertwined. And so I'm kind of going to go through a timeline, and we're going to start off in 1968. When Dr. John Opitz, who's a geneticist, and at the time he was in Wisconsin, he was asked to evaluate an 11-week-old little boy for hypotonia, or low muscle tone, developmental delay, sparse curly hair, ptosis, which is kind of a droopy eyelid, hyperkeratosis of the skin, which is a thickening of the skin, an abnormal EEG, and possible heart defect. And this was a referral from a cardiologist. A couple of years later, he saw two more children, and so in 1969 he saw a 4.5-month-old little girl who was referred for a cavernous hemangioma, so kind of a, almost like a strawberry mark, who was thought to represent a variant of Noonan syndrome, and a 3.5-year-old girl referred for developmental delays, heart defect, also a cavernous hemangioma, a cleft palate, eye abnormalities, and skin problems, and also thought to represent a variant of Noonan syndrome, which this is a picture of a little boy with Noonan syndrome who is named after Dr. Jackie Noonan, who, is she here? There she is. So, pediatric cardiologist who's been also very heavily involved with the Noonan organizations and CFC. And so at the time he thought, you know, these maybe represent Noonan syndrome, but he thought that they could represent something different. In 1979, so a few years later, there was a separate group of geneticists that were giving a presentation at a March of Dimes Birth Defects Conference. And this conference actually started in 1968, the year that he saw that first patient. And this conference was meant to get together doctors, and which would eventually become our first generation of clinical geneticists, who would see patients in the clinic and really try to get an underlying diagnosis for them. And while he was at this conference, there were two other children that had very similar characteristics to the patients that Dr. Opitz had originally seen. And when we look back at the literature, actually, there are two papers that are published in 1973 and 1979 that describe two different children that had features that we would probably consider to be CFC syndrome today. But at the time, they were not given a diagnosis. From that group, from that 1979 meeting, Dr. Jim Reynolds, who was there, worked with Dr. Opitz and Dr. Giovanni Neri, who's pictured here, and other geneticists to put together a publication of all of their cases, all their patients, that they thought represented a new syndrome. And this was submitted for publication in 1985, and it was published in 1986. And this was what we consider kind of the seminal paper for CFC syndrome. And so they described 8 patients, and these are 3 of the pictures from that 1986 paper of kids that had similar characteristics, and some of the common features that they had included a distinct facial appearance, they say, ectodermal abnormalities, so kind of curly hair, skin changes, missing eyebrows, delayed hair growth, some psychomotor and growth delay, so short stature and some developmental delay, and also cardiac defects. And so after this paper was published, physicians were able to recognize and actually put a name to what they thought these groups of features represented. And so they called it a new syndrome with cardiofacio-cutaneous involvement, or the CFC syndrome. Meanwhile, in New Jersey, a mom named Nancy Carlson, she was the mother of a little girl. She was initially diagnosed with Noonan syndrome at the age of 2, but Nancy didn't feel that she really fit that diagnosis after doing her own research. And so her cardiologist had actually been to a conference where he had heard about this new condition called CFC syndrome, and he felt that that might be a better fit for her. And she took that information back to her geneticist, who also agreed that it was probably CFC syndrome that her daughter actually had. But she wanted to find other parents because there was really no information about CFC out there. And this is back in the early 90s, where we didn't have, the internet was just starting to come up. There weren't a lot of, it definitely wasn't Facebook. And so what she did was she wrote a letter to a magazine called Exceptional Parent, searching for another parent. And Google is amazing, so I Google searched, I'm like, what is this Exceptional Parent magazine? And this is a picture from what it might have looked like back in 1993 of Exceptional Parent magazine. And if you look down here, there's a section called Family Support. You can't read that, but it says Family Support, and it includes letters to the editor, parent search, and parents' responses. And so she put an ad out there looking for other parents. Also, in the scientific world at this time in the early 90s, there was a debate now going on with, is Noonan syndrome different than CFC syndrome, or do they represent the same condition and just different ends of the spectrum, with Noonan syndrome being on the slightly milder side of the spectrum and CFC having some more medical or developmental involvement. And so there were some splitters that thought they were 2 distinct conditions, and lumpers that thought these are just all one syndrome and they represent different ends of the spectrum. And so some of the headlines in the medical articles at the time included, the Noonan CFC controversy, lumping versus splitting, are they really the same, are they not? And what we know now, and Dr. Brown's going to give her presentation after this, is that they're both kind of right, in that we know that these are 2 distinct syndromes, but because of the shared pathway in the genes that they have in common, they're part of the same family. So back to Nancy. So she did start finding other parents and soon began to answer calls regularly from other parents out of her home, and just started to send out newsletters, and this was back in October of 1991. Between 1991 and 1993, it was starting to get a little bit expensive sending newsletters from her home, so she started an online Yahoo groups, and this was formed to connect parents with children of CFC syndrome. And then in 1993, this little guy was born. This is Cliffy Conger. And after 3 years of searching for a diagnosis, Cliffy was diagnosed with CFC syndrome. And this is not a super recent picture, but this is one of the pictures that we used in our guidelines that I'll talk about in a minute. So Brenda happened to find an ad from Nancy through the Exceptional Parent magazine and contacted her, and would later go visit her in New Jersey from her home in New York State. Brenda, correct me if I'm wrong in any of this. So over the years, Brenda had worked with Nancy, and then it soon became apparent that Brenda really wanted to take this group and to make it larger and to try to reach out to more families. And so Brenda took over the CFC organization at that time, the support group, in 1997, and there were just 21 members at the time. But Brenda had a vision and a mission, and I think anyone who has met Brenda knows that it's a very strong and passionate vision and mission, and it's really what made CFC International what it is today. And she went through a lot of training, a lot of advocacy, involvement on a national level, on a state level, and she ended up incorporating and to make it CFC Family Network. And so that was the original name at the time. And so their first CFC conference was actually held in 2000, the following year, in Salt Lake City, where Dr. Opitz ended up practicing. And there were 37 families in attendance. And so at this time, the genes for CFC syndrome were still not known, nor were the genes for Noonan syndrome or Costello syndrome known yet. And so the clinics were really spent, so thank you all for attending the clinics yesterday. And at the time, though, the clinics were focused on seeing a child and trying to classify them as, do they have CFC syndrome, do they have Noonan syndrome, or do they have Costello syndrome, or maybe some other condition that's not one of those three, or are they CFC/Noonan? And so this was a really fun time to really try to clinically diagnose kids, because we didn't have any genetic testing available to say for sure what condition they had. In 2003, Brenda had established a paper registry, and so this was a mechanism to try to capture every child with CFC syndrome and all of their medical information. And so her house was overrun with file cabinets, probably up until recently, where she had files and files and records and charts and photos of any child or family who had contacted her, and just trying to establish this paper registry. In 2004, the CFC Family Network changed to CFC International and introduced a new logo. And this is also around the time that I ended up moving to Salt Lake City, Utah, and saw my second little guy with CFC syndrome with Dr. Opitz as well. And so at this time, the organization now grew to almost 100 families. And also within this time frame, around 2001, one of the genes for Noonan syndrome was identified by Dr. Gelb's group, who's here today and going to be speaking also later today. And so this was also a huge step in the history of CFC, because now we could actually test kids for CFC to see if they had the most common gene associated with Noonan syndrome. And so at this time, I think this was kind of one of the big steps for CFC as an organization, is that they decided to collaborate with the Genetic Alliance Biobank program, which was a program that would get blood on children and parents to bank it with the hopes of eventually identifying the genes that cause CFC syndrome. And so this was in 2004, and this really sparked the interest of researchers, because now you have a large group of children with an unknown genetic condition, or with a condition with an unknown genetic cause, and you know, it's sort of a great group to try to really identify a gene. And so in 2005, that's what we did, is we collaborated and partnered with Dr. Rowan at UCSF at the time. And it wasn't long thereafter, with the DNA made available through the biobank and with collaboration with CFC International, they were now on the hunt for the genetic cause of CFC syndrome. And then success. So in January of 2016, the genetic cause of CFC syndrome was identified, and this was the paper that was published in Science. So it says germline mutations in genes within the MAP kinase or MAPK pathway cause cardiofaciocutaneous syndrome. And if you can see on here, it's hard to read, but Brenda and Molly, who was the vice president at the time, are listed as authors on this paper because of their contribution to this scientific work. And so that was January 26th, 2006. It was published online for the first time. And it was from a small group of 23 kids from this organization that were really hand-selected by Brenda and Molly and Dr. Rowan, where they were able to narrow down and say, we're going to use this small group of kids and try to find the genes associated, and they were able to do it. Just about 2 weeks later, another paper was published by a group in Japan that identified a fourth gene called KRAS in their cohort of kids. And so they had found KRAS and changes in some of these genes as well. That led to the first international scientific symposium on CFC and Noonan syndrome. And we're going to have another scientific symposium, and we've had them every other year since then, and it's going to be held next month, where we're going to, Les Rogers and Jeff and Gina are going to be attending. And so from really 2000 on, CFC International continued to host conferences every 2 years, and every time it's getting larger and larger, which is incredible, and it's incredible to be a part of it. And so for the first time, now that we knew the genetic cause of CFC, and we knew that CFC and Noonan syndrome and Costello syndrome were 3 distinct conditions, but they were all in the same family, we decided to combine with Noonan and Costello to hold a joint conference and scientific symposium in Berkeley, California in 2009. And this was a huge conference. We did that for a few years, and then it's almost started to get a little too large, and so now we're kind of back to our own individual syndrome conferences. But from that, we realized that Noonan syndrome at the time had been working on some consensus guidelines and to help guide management of children with Noonan syndrome, and we thought that we needed some guidelines for CFC syndrome because it's not the same as Noonan syndrome. The kids have different needs, and we need to address those needs and also have a way for pediatricians and other specialists to understand what those needs are. And so we funded a consensus meeting to be held in San Francisco that included the CFC Medical Advisory Board and also other experts to join together to draft management guidelines for CFC syndrome. And so this is a picture from that meeting, and you can see many of the faces that you met in clinic yesterday and that are in the audience today. So here's Dr. Rowan. Dr. Wolford is a psychologist and also a mom to Stone, who has CFC syndrome, Dr. Shankar, Dr. Noonan, here's Brenda and Molly, Dr. Mariella Pierpont, Dr. Sullivan was our neurologist at the time. We really were trying to get him back. Dr. Adi is an endocrinologist who was there. Amy Roberts at Boston Children's, a geneticist. Dr. Kawamura, dermatology, who you met yesterday. Dr. Rini Pierpont, myself, and then Dr. Kurt Reinker with orthopedics. And so this was kind of a great team and collaboration. And we spent really about 2 days just going over each of the different areas and what we thought should be done, at what age should we start certain evaluations, and how often should we do them. And so in 2013, I feel like we had a research milestone where we decided, we've been doing fundraising, we've been getting a lot of money, what are we doing? What are the next steps? One kind of goal of the organization was to identify the genes, and that was done. A second, and really an underlying theme for the organization, is research. How can we help our families? And so we decided to fund a research study and to have a first grant, and this is to assess growth and endocrine issues in CFC syndrome. And so this is a study that I was fortunate to get the funding for and that many of you have participated in, and it's still ongoing. And so we're really trying to create growth curves so that we can track kids with CFC syndrome according to their own growth curves. And so many of you have participated already and participated yesterday, and we're still looking, we're still gathering data and starting to analyze some of that information that we've already received. The following year, we published the consensus and management guidelines for CFC syndrome, and these are available online. I have copies of them as well, if anyone would like to see them, but I think these should be handed out and read and given to really every specialist that you have, and definitely your pediatrician, because it is nice. They give tables and ways that you can actually follow and say, okay, what are the issues in GI that we need to be concerned about? What are the neurology issues? What are the growth and endocrine issues? And so this is a good tool to be able to give families so that they can share with their physicians. And then the following year, we created or kind of updated the Understanding CFC Syndrome, which is a guide for parents, providers, and educators. And this is really an informational and care management booklet that we developed to help families, especially new families when they're just getting a diagnosis and often feel alone or don't know where to turn for information. And so this is Emily. And that brings us to today. And so this is the 9th CFC International Family Conference. This is my 7th one, so I missed the first 2. We have over 80 families in attendance, over 400 families that have been registered with CFC International. When you think about where we started with just 21 families, it's been a huge growth and really within not a lot of time. And we've had over 50 families alone in the past year, which is incredible. And when I think of the future for CFC, I have to look at our mission, and it's to strive to help each other cope with the challenges of raising a child with a rare and often medically involved disorder, to act as a clearinghouse of information on all aspects of CFC syndrome by publishing a newsletter, an address book, a parent's guide for all registered families, and to educate the general public, the medical profession, and government agencies by disseminating information on CFC syndrome. I think this organization has been incredible. We have a very strong medical advisory board, very strong leadership and board of directors, and really CFC International wouldn't be what it is without the history, without those pioneers that didn't stop to try to understand what was going on with a particular child, why they were had certain features that they had, and what caused that, and vice versa. The CFC medical community wouldn't be where it is at all without CFC International. And now I know all of you are also on this journey as well, and it's not necessarily a role that you've chosen, and I know that it's often not. There's lots of ups and downs that go with being a parent of having a child with CFC syndrome, and you didn't necessarily choose that role, but we have chosen you to work with and to grow with and to hopefully advocate for generations of children with CFC in the future. And this is a quote that Brenda uses a lot, and I love it as well. And so never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I just wanted to acknowledge Alexis Potts, who's a genetic counselor that has actually done some writing on the history of CFC. Dr. John Opitz initially for never giving up and really recognizing that this is something that we need to look further at. All of you for being here and coming together. The CFC International Board of Directors, the Medical Advisory Board, and of course, Brenda Conger. Thank you so much.